Eventually, a moment arrives that they never thought would come. A moment when all the watching, all the guessing, all the analyzing, and all the attempts to regain control lead to the same unavoidable conclusion. They have lost access. Not temporary access. Permanent access. And that realization hits harder than they expected. Because for a long time, they convinced themselves they still had influence. Maybe they thought you would eventually return. Maybe they believed one more message, one more manipulation tactic, one more carefully calculated move would reopen the door. Maybe they assumed the version of you they once knew was still somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to be triggered back into old patterns. But time kept proving them wrong. You did not return to the old cycle. You did not reopen the same emotional doors. You did not hand back the access they once enjoyed. Instead, you kept evolving. And with every step forward, the distance between who you are now and who you used to be became impossible to ignore. That is when the final realization begins settling in. They no longer know what motivates you. They no longer know what affects you. They no longer know what your next move will be. They no longer know how to reach the version of you they once influenced. Because that version no longer exists. Read that again. That version no longer exists. And this is the part that creates the deepest panic for controlling people. Not because they lost a battle. Not because they lost an argument. But because they lost access to the one thing they valued most. Predictability. The map is gone. The patterns are gone. The emotional shortcuts are gone. The old playbook is gone. And now they are forced to accept a reality they spent a long time resisting. You are no longer operating from the wounds they learned to manipulate. You are operating from awareness, from discernment, from emotional discipline, from peace. That changes everything. Because a chosen one who has reclaimed their mind becomes extremely difficult to control. The manipulation loses power. The confusion loses power. The emotional hooks lose power. And eventually the people who depended on those tactics are left standing at the edge of a closed chapter they can no longer enter. That is their final realization. They did not lose access to your attention. They lost access to your energy. And once that happens, the game is over. There was a time when they could predict you. They knew exactly which buttons to push. They knew which words would trigger an emotional reaction. They knew how to create confusion, guilt, frustration, or self-doubt. After years of studying your patterns, they became confident that they understood how your mind worked. And because they believed they could predict your responses, they believed they could control the outcome. That was the old dynamic. Every manipulation depended on access. Access to your emotions. Access to your attention. Access to your energy. They knew if they applied enough pressure in the right place, eventually they would get the reaction they wanted. And for a while it worked. Not because you were weak, but because you were still healing. You were still learning. You were still trying to understand why certain people seemed so committed to creating chaos around your life. But something changed. You evolved. You stopped reacting the way you used to. You stopped explaining yourself to people determined to misunderstand you. You stopped rushing to defend your name. You stopped handing out emotional access to everyone who demanded it. Most importantly, you became quiet. Not defeated. Not afraid. Quiet. And that silence changed the entire battlefield. Because manipulators rely on one thing to survive: predictability. They knew exactly which buttons to push to make you break. But then you evolved. You stopped reacting, you went quiet, and you became completely unreadable. Now they are terrified because they have absolutely no idea what you're going to do next. That uncertainty is their nightmare. The version of you they spent years studying no longer exists. The emotional map they relied on is outdated. The predictable reactions they once counted on have disappeared. And now every move they make is based on information that is no longer accurate. For the first time, they are facing a chosen one they cannot read. And that changes everything. The most frustrating thing happening to them right now is not your success. It is the fact that their old playbook no longer works. For years, they relied on the same strategies because those strategies produced predictable results. If they wanted your attention, they knew how to create drama. If they wanted an emotional reaction, they knew exactly where to apply pressure. If they wanted to throw you off balance, they knew which insecurities to target. Everything felt calculated. Everything felt controlled. And because those tactics worked in the past, they assumed they would work forever. That assumption became their weakness. What they failed to understand is that healing changes the architecture of a person's mind. Growth disconnects old triggers. Self-awareness exposes manipulation. Emotional maturity creates space between an attack and a reaction. The very patterns they depended on begin disappearing one by one. So now they keep reaching for buttons that no longer exist. They try guilt. Nothing. They try provocation. Nothing. They try indirect messages. Nothing. They try creating jealousy. Nothing. They try reminding you of old wounds. Nothing. Every tactic that once generated predictable reactions now crashes into silence. And that silence is driving them crazy. Because manipulators do not just depend on control. They depend on feedback. They need evidence that their actions are producing an effect. They need emotional responses to confirm they still have access to your inner world. When that feedback disappears, uncertainty takes its place. Suddenly they start questioning themselves. Did the message work? Did they notice? Do they care? Are they upset? Have they moved on? The questions keep multiplying because the answers are no longer available. And that lack of information creates panic. Think about it. Someone who spent years believing they understood you is now discovering that their understanding was tied to an outdated version of you. Every prediction they make turns out wrong. Every assumption fails. Every attempt to influence your behavior produces less and less return. That is a devastating realization for a controlling person. Because control requires predictability. And predictability requires access. They have neither. What makes this even harder for them is that your transformation happened gradually. They did not recognize it at first. They assumed you were having a temporary phase. They believed eventually you would return to the old patterns. Eventually you would explain yourself. Eventually you would defend yourself. Eventually you would become emotionally available to their tactics again. But that day never came. Instead, you became more grounded, more disciplined, more observant, more selective about where your energy goes. And every step of that evolution pushed you further beyond the reach of their manipulation. Now they find themselves using the same old strategies while getting completely different results. It is like trying to unlock a door with a key that no longer fits. The tool remains the same, but the mechanism has changed. That is why their playbook has become useless. Not because they stopped trying, but because you stopped being the person those tactics were designed to control. And the more they realize that, the more they begin understanding a truth they never wanted to face. The version of you they once manipulated is gone, and it is not coming back. Once the old playbook stops working, they enter a new phase, the surveillance phase. Because when manipulators lose access, they immediately start searching for information. They become desperate for clues, desperate for patterns, desperate for anything that helps them regain the predictability they once enjoyed. That is why some of them are watching more closely than ever before. Not because they are at peace, not because they have moved on, but because uncertainty is making them uncomfortable. They check your social media looking for signs. They pay attention to who interacts with your content. They notice changes in your routine. They listen carefully when mutual connections mention your name. They search for hints that reveal what you are thinking, where you are going, and what stage of life you are entering. Because information feels like control. And right now, control feels very far away. The problem is that the more they watch, the less they understand. Your life no longer follows the predictable patterns they memorized. You are not broadcasting every decision. You are not explaining every move. You are not providing a detailed map of your future for everyone to analyze. You have become intentional about what you reveal and what you keep private. That shift has created a vacuum, and manipulators hate vacuums. When information is missing, the mind starts filling in the blanks. Assumptions appear. Theories form. Speculation grows. Suddenly they are spending enormous amounts of energy trying to decode a person who is no longer giving them access to the answers. And the irony is that their obsession creates even more confusion. The harder they look, the less clarity they gain. Because your silence is forcing them to confront something they never had to face before. They do not actually know you anymore. Read that again. They do not actually know you anymore. They know an old version of you. They know old reactions, old wounds, old habits, old fears. But the person you are becoming exists beyond the information they collected years ago. That realization is deeply unsettling. For a long time, they felt psychologically ahead of you. They believed they understood your next move before you made it. They believed they could anticipate your reactions, influence your decisions, and predict your behavior with remarkable accuracy. Now they cannot. And that loss of certainty is creating anxiety. Because every day you remain unreadable is another reminder that they no longer have the access they once enjoyed. Every day you continue growing privately is another reminder that your life is moving beyond their reach. Every day they search for answers and fail to find them is another reminder that the connection they depended on has been severed. That is why they watch. Not from confidence, but from confusion. Not because they have power, but because they lost it. And while they are busy monitoring your movements, trying to gather clues and reconstruct a map that no longer reflects reality, you are quietly building a future they cannot predict. That is what truly unsettles them. The fact that somewhere beyond their field of vision, your next chapter is already taking shape, and they have absolutely no idea what it looks like. Most people misunderstand silence. They think silence is passive. They think silence means retreat. They think silence is what happens when someone has nothing left to say. But in spiritual warfare, silence can become one of the most powerful forces on the battlefield, because silence removes access. And when access disappears, control begins collapsing. That is exactly what happened when you stopped reacting the way they expected. At first, they assumed you were simply taking a break. They believed eventually you would return to the old cycle. Eventually you would defend yourself. Eventually you would explain your choices. Eventually you would respond to the bait they kept throwing into your path. But the response never came. And that absence created something they were completely unprepared for. A mirror. You see, when you constantly react to manipulation, the focus stays on you. Your emotions become the topic. Your responses become the distraction. The manipulator never has to sit alone with their own behavior because your reaction gives them something else to study. Silence changes that. The moment you stop feeding the cycle, the spotlight shifts. Suddenly there is no reaction to analyze, no emotional outburst to discuss, no explanation to pick apart, no argument to continue. The manipulator is left staring into an empty space where your attention used to be. And that empty space becomes a mirror. Now they are forced to sit with their own thoughts, their own insecurities, their own uncertainty, their own obsession. That is why silence creates so much anxiety for controlling people. It forces them to confront what they spent years avoiding. Without your reactions to distract them, they become trapped inside their own overthinking. Questions start multiplying. Why aren't they responding? Do they still care? Have they moved on? Are they angry? Are they planning something? Did they finally figure everything out? Notice what is happening. The person who once tried to control your emotions is now being controlled by their own imagination. That is the hidden power of silence. Not revenge, not punishment, clarity. Because when you remove yourself from unnecessary conflict, people reveal the stories they tell themselves. They expose their fears, their assumptions, their emotional dependence on access they no longer possess. And the longer your silence continues, the more intense that process becomes. They begin analyzing tiny details, reading meaning into things that may not even exist, looking for hidden messages, searching for certainty where none is available. The lack of information becomes so uncomfortable that their own minds start generating endless possibilities. That is where the spiral begins. And the irony is that you do not have to do anything. You do not have to manipulate. You do not have to retaliate. You do not have to prove a point. Your peace does the work for you. Because every day you remain grounded, every day you refuse unnecessary drama, every day you choose emotional discipline over reaction, the silence grows louder. Not in your mind, in theirs. And eventually they begin realizing that what they once interpreted as weakness was actually strength. What they once saw as withdrawal was actually mastery. And what they once believed was surrender was the moment they permanently lost control of the narrative. One of the greatest freedoms you discover during this transformation is that you no longer feel obligated to explain yourself. That may sound simple, but for many chosen ones, it is a revolutionary shift. Because there was a time when you felt responsible for making sure everyone understood you. You wanted people to know your intentions. You wanted them to see your heart. You wanted to correct misunderstandings, clear up false narratives, and provide explanations whenever someone questioned your decisions. You believed clarity would create peace. But over time, you learned something important. Not everyone is confused because they lack information. Some people are committed to misunderstanding you. And once you realize that, everything changes. You stop exhausting yourself trying to convince people who have already chosen their conclusions. You stop handing out detailed explanations to individuals who view every answer as another opportunity to judge, manipulate, or control. You stop feeling guilty for protecting parts of your life from unnecessary scrutiny. That is the freedom of ambiguity. The understanding that not everyone deserves full access to your journey. Not everyone needs updates. Not everyone needs explanations. Not everyone needs to know what you are building, where you are going, or what your next move will be. And surprisingly, that freedom creates peace. Because the more private your growth becomes, the less vulnerable it is to outside interference. Dreams grow stronger when they are protected. Healing becomes deeper when it is not constantly being analyzed. Progress accelerates when you stop seeking permission from people who were never assigned to your path. That is where many chosen ones are right now. For the first time in their lives, they are learning to move without announcing every step. They are learning to make decisions without conducting public debates. They are learning to trust themselves without requiring constant validation. And that confidence is powerful. Because manipulative people thrive on information. They thrive on knowing where to apply pressure. They thrive on understanding your priorities, your fears, your plans, and your emotional vulnerabilities. Information gives them leverage. Ambiguity removes it. Now they are left guessing, wondering, speculating, trying to connect dots that no longer form a clear picture. And while they are busy searching for answers, you are busy living. Read that again. While they are busy searching for answers, you are busy living. That is the real victory. Not making people curious. Not creating mystery for attention. But becoming so focused on your purpose that you no longer feel the need to constantly explain yourself to the world. You owe honesty to yourself. You owe integrity to your path. But you do not owe unrestricted access to everyone who demands it. That chapter is over. And the beautiful thing about this new season is that your life becomes harder to manipulate because it becomes harder to map. People can no longer build strategies around information they do not possess. They can no longer anticipate moves they cannot see. They can no longer control narratives when they have lost direct access to the source. And the more comfortable you become with ambiguity, the stronger your peace becomes. Because true freedom begins the moment you stop feeling obligated to explain your existence to people who were never meant to direct it. So if there is one thing I want you to remember after hearing this message, it is this. Do not mistake your silence for weakness. Do not mistake your privacy for isolation. And do not mistake your peace for passivity. What you have built is something many people never achieve. You have learned how to exist without constantly reacting. You have learned how to protect your energy without explaining every decision. You have learned how to move forward without giving everyone a front row seat to your journey. That is not avoidance. That is growth. Because the strongest version of you is not the one who wins every argument. It is not the one who proves every critic wrong. It is not the one who spends endless energy defending itself from people committed to misunderstanding it. The strongest version of you is the one who remains focused on purpose, the one who protects peace, the one who keeps evolving while others remain trapped studying an outdated version of who you used to be. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them search for answers they no longer have access to. Your responsibility is not to satisfy their curiosity. Your responsibility is to continue building the life you were meant to live. And the beautiful thing is that every day you remain grounded, every day you refuse unnecessary drama, and every day you choose emotional discipline over reaction, you become even harder to predict. Not because you are playing games, but because you are no longer living from old wounds. You are living from wisdom. If this message spoke directly to your spirit, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs this reminder today. And in the comments, type, "I protect my peace." Let that declaration remind you that your greatest power was never control over others. It was mastering yourself.